People of the internet, tonight we are debating Capitalism of Ayn Rand, and we are starting right now with the opening statement from Dr. Norton. Dr. Norton, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, guys. I'm Dan Norton. I have a PhD in philosophy, and I advocate Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. You can find my work on my YouTube channel, which is linked in the description. I want to thank Modern Day Debate for hosting this event, and thank Ben for agreeing to debate, and the audience for being here and participating. In my opening statement, which I'm told I have up to 12 minutes for, I'm going to be laying out Ayn Rand's defense of capitalism as I understand it. Let me start by asking you to imagine that you are stranded alone on an island. Perhaps you are shipwrecked. In any case, once on the island, you now have a choice. You can choose to try to survive, or you can just give up and let yourself die. You can starve to death. Let's suppose you choose to try to survive. How will you do it? Well, perhaps most obviously, you need to get food. But how will you do that? You can't just wish food into existence. Praying doesn't work. You need to do things like search for edible plants or catch fish. But which plants are poisonous and which are edible? How can one catch fish? We aren't born with the knowledge of how to survive. We need to discover that knowledge and then act accordingly. To discover the knowledge we need to survive, we need to think. We need to use our rational capacity and engage with the world. If we do so, we might discover which plants are edible, how to catch fish, how to build a shelter, how to build fire, which plants have medicinal value, and so on. If we stop thinking, if we stop using our rational minds, we lose our ability to survive or to improve our lives. Now let's say another person washes up on the island. Is that good for you or bad? Well, it depends on what kind of person it is. If it's another person who uses reason to discover knowledge and help himself survive, then he could be good for you. Maybe he can discover and teach you survival skills that you didn't have. And maybe you can also teach him things. By working together, sharing your knowledge, and trading, you can both survive better than either of you could alone. On the other hand, suppose a different sort of person washes ashore. Suppose it's a lazy bum who doesn't ever want to put forth the effort of thinking and producing values. He just wants to live on you as a parasite. He happened to have a gun on him when he arrived, let's suppose. And he uses that gun to make you his slave. He just points his gun at you and orders you around. In this case, the person who came ashore is bad for you. He's just a drain on your resources. You would be better off alone. It's the threat of physical force, the gun, that allows him to make your survival worse, if not impossible. Thus, it's in your interest to have others on the island, only if they agree not to use or threaten physical force against you. Force negates the value of reason. It's pointless to reason if doing so does not allow you to reap some kind of reward. But force doesn't just make reasoning pointless. It also makes reasoning impossible. If someone points a gun at you and demands that you believe 2 + 2 is 5, or that the earth doesn't move and the sun goes around it, you cannot make yourself believe that if you have seen no evidence supporting it, or if you have seen evidence contradicting it. You can mouth the words, but that's not the same as believing it. As Ayn Rand says, a gun is not an argument, unquote. What would have become of the scientific and industrial revolutions if men such as Galileo tried to think in compliance with the dogmas of religion rather than following their own independent judgment? Their thinking would have been stifled. Those revolutions would not have happened, and we would not enjoy the modern technological civilization that we enjoy today. Now, returning to the island example, I said that a person who subjects you to force on the island would be bad for you. But that evaluation assumes a certain standard of evaluation, in particular, an egoistic standard, according to which something is good for you if and only if it helps you achieve your survival. If, however, egoism is bad, if self-sacrifice is the moral ideal, as it is for many people, then a life as a slave might actually be good for you. On a morality of self-sacrifice, what grounds do you have to object when others wield force against you? Insisting that you have the right to live your own life as you see fit would betray an egoistic and selfish attitude, which is the opposite of self-sacrifice. If self-sacrifice is good, it's better to submit to coercion. Thus, an ethics of self-sacrifice is in conflict with a politics of freedom. Freedom enables one to achieve one's survival by using one's mind to one's own benefit. But if one shouldn't pursue one's own benefit, if one should be selfless, there are no grounds for insisting on freedom. Instead, one should give it up. Being free is in one's self-interest. Being a slave is not. In Ayn Rand's view, only an ethics of egoism can ground the politics of freedom. Only if it is right for an individual to pursue his own interest does it make sense to banish force from human relationships. And that's what capitalism does. It allows people to interact with each other only on a voluntary basis. Initiating physical force against others is prohibited. Force can only be used in retaliation, that is, in self-defense. The role of the government in a capitalist system is, and only is, to protect people from force. Thus, the government has a police force to protect people from domestic criminals, a military to protect people from foreign threats, and a court system to settle disputes peacefully. But that's about it. The government does not itself act like a criminal and coerce its own citizens. This means that under capitalism, there are no taxes. Taxation is a form of coercion. If you do not give some of your money to the government, you will eventually be hauled off to jail by people with guns. Programs that are funded by taxation, such as Social Security, Medicare, welfare, and public education, all depend on coercion and do not exist in a capitalist system. Nor would there be any regulations. And by regulations here, I mean laws that interfere with voluntary actions. For instance, minimum wage laws that force employers to pay at least a certain amount, even though employees might voluntarily agree to a lesser amount. Or laws that prohibit you from taking a drug that lacks FDA approval, even though you might want to take it. The vast array of regulatory bodies that now exists, the FDA, SEC, OSHA, EPA, etc., would not exist under capitalism. A world without taxes and regulations is obviously a far cry from what we have today. So blaming today's problems on capitalism, as is so often done by socialists and others, is to attack a straw man. What we have today in America, and have had for many decades, is a mixed economy, not capitalism. That is, we have a mixture of freedom and coercion. And it's the coercive element, not the free element, that causes problems. Freedom is good. Coercion is bad. No country has ever been entirely free of coercion. But perhaps the US in the late 19th century came the closest. And this was a period of explosive growth for the country, in which millions of people immigrated here for a better life. Freedom and progress go together. This is not an accident. When men are left free to think, and act on their own independent judgment, they can discover new knowledge and build new technology that pushes mankind forward and raises everyone's standard of living. When thought is stifled through government control of speech, when production and trade are stifled by taxes and regulations, progress slows and mankind stagnates or even retrogresses. To conclude, Ayn Rand's defense of capitalism in a nutshell is that capitalism is the system consistent with the requirements of man's survival. Man survives by reason, but force, to the degree it is used, makes reasoning pointless and impossible. It negates and paralyzes the mind. So if survival is the proper goal, which it is according to Rand, the proper social system is one that abolishes force and leaves man free to think and reap the rewards. Capitalism is that system. It is the system of freedom and of reason, and it is the only moral system if man's life on earth is the proper standard of morality, which, according to Ayn Rand, it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Norton, for your opening statement. And I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Dr. Burgis for your opening statement.
All right. Thank you, Kez. Thank you, Dan. I do want to start out by just dispensing with a very typical but very unhelpful libertarian straw man, which is the idea that debates about capitalism, and socialism, and taxation, and redistribution, and property rights have anything whatsoever to do with attitudes towards coercion. They don't. It's a red herring. All systems of property are coercive by definition. Property just is a claim to a right to exclude other people for the use of some resource. All distributions of property are backed by threats of coercion, unless you redefine the word coercion in a silly way to mean like unjustified coercion, in which case you're just begging the question. So a no trespassing sign is every bit as much a threat of coercion as a overdue notice from the IRS. What we're arguing about when we argue about capitalism, socialism, and equality and property rights is not coercion good or bad. It's certainly not reasoning good or bad. It's which system of property should be coercively enforced, right? Which distribution of scarce resources should be coercively enforced? Now, just to very briefly lay my own cards on the table, I agree with the great socialist analytic philosopher G.A. Cohen in accepting a fairly radical version of the principle of equality of opportunity, whereby social systems that tend to produce inequalities that are linked to factors outside of your control, whether that's skin color or gender, or whether you were born into a rich family or a poor one, or whether you happen to have certain skills that are prioritized by the kind of society that you live in innately, are to that extent unjust. Not the only thing that can make inequalities unjust, but it's certainly a thing. So I think that the system we should coercively enforce is a much more equal distribution than Dan does or that Ayn Rand did. But as much as I would be very happy to get into what I think a more just and equal system would look like in the open back and forth or in the Q&A, that's not the main subject that we're here to talk about tonight. The main subject that we're here to talk about tonight is not socialism, but capitalism, and specifically Ayn Rand's defense of capitalism. And I think to really understand that defense, you need to get into Ayn Rand's values. Because it is really important, Dan, to his credit, was very frank about this in his opening, to recognize that when Rand defends capitalism, she's not defending the halfway civilized kind of modern capitalism under which we have a social safety net to guarantee that people don't just starve in the streets if they fall through the cracks of the system, under which we have civil rights laws to stop restaurant owners in Alabama from hanging whites-only signs in their windows, under which we have Medicare and Medicaid to make sure that the old and the destitute don't die of easily treatable diseases. That's not what she's defending. What she's defending is a kind of quote-unquote capitalism. Now, the word capitalism is used by everybody else, refers to a specific mode of production that exists at a certain time in human history, not this moral ideal that Rand is talking about. But what she's talking about is a kind of brutal, unregulated capitalism under which, as we just heard, no social security laws, no workplace safety regulation, no civil rights laws, no health care, provided to people who can't afford private insurance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even if you disagree with, my socialist ideas, even if you think those go too far, you should be able to recognize that this is a really sociopathic moral ideal that is being defended. So, and I should also say that as much as Randians like to have it both ways about the relationship between the kind of capitalism they advocate and the kind of capitalism that's actually existed in history, saying, no, you can't blame anything bad on the problems of capitalism. You can, because it's not real capitalism at the same time, wanting to take credit for capitalism's achievements, to say, oh, the good parts are because of the parts that are truly capitalist, right? Everything positive that happened in the Gilded Age in the 19th century that Dan was talking about is because of that. It's only the negative stuff that's not because of that. It's more or less the same bait and switch you get from religious believers who say that all the good things about nature testify to the glories of God. All the bad things are a result of original sin. But if we're talking about Rand's ideal of capitalism, not only would it be morally grotesque in all the ways that we just went over, it would be one that it wouldn't even be consistent with a thriving economy. Rand said many times that she wanted a separation of economy and state as total as the separation of church and state in the American constitutional system, which would mean, and we just heard from Dan when he listed off the acceptable functions of government, what wasn't on that list? Maintaining public roads that deliveries can happen on, chartering corporations, having, the state minting currency. And of course, without these things, there could be no functional economy at all. We'd have absolute economic collapse if we got rid of those things. So don't take Randians seriously when they want to take credit for the good parts of capitalism. But why does she defend this particularly savage kind of unregulated capitalism with all of its brutal human consequences that we saw in that Gilded Age that Dan was just praising? Well, she justified it by reference to so-called objectivist ethics, by which no one ever has a moral duty to sacrifice his or her interests for the interests of anyone else. Or at least she sometimes said that. If you listen closely to Rand or listen closely to Dan just now, it's a little inconsistent, because there is an exception for sacrificing your interests to the interests of others when it's a question of sacrificing your interests in the name of respecting libertarian property rights, as when you wash up on an island where all of the usable resources are already private property and no one will share, and you have a duty, I guess, in that case to not survive. I'd actually be fascinated to hear what the result would be in that scenario. But she certainly thinks that people should have to live pretty miserable lives if that's the consequence of rejecting the right of rich people to keep every last dollar in their bank accounts. What she doesn't think anyone should have to do is to sacrifice their interests, even very slightly, even with a slight increase in the tax rate, in order to secure other people's rights to healthcare or housing or education or a voice in what happens in their workplace, because she says this would violate objectivist ethics. Well, what on earth is that? Well, Rand liked to make silly statements like her epistemology is objective reality, which is just a nonsensical way of putting together words. Everybody thinks what they believe in is objective reality, and epistemology is the study of how we figure out which things are objectively true. But pressed for details, she tended to say things like that we should only believe things on the basis of empirical observation of regular non-moral facts. And of course, as David Hume showed centuries ago, there is no way to derive any moral values, whether Ayn Rand's or anyone else's, from the base non-moral facts. A study of the non-moral facts can tell us how to achieve the moral and political goals we care about. It certainly can't tell us which moral and political goals we should care about in the first place. That doesn't mean there's no role for moral reasoning. There is, but that role is best described by the great 20th century political philosopher John Rawls, who said that what we're doing when we engage in moral reasoning is a process of reflective equilibrium. we're trying to bring the values that we care about together into an internally consistent picture, which might do things like doing things like, for example, rejecting certain shallowly held values in favor of deeper, more important values. And of course, when you start doing that, there's absolutely no reason to take Rand's extreme and fairly inhuman value system seriously as a contender. Now, she tried to make it less absurd by constructing a straw man of all the other schools of modern moral philosophy, which she said were all altruism. They were all about pure self-sacrifice. You're not allowed to promote your own flourishing as an individual at all. You have to just live for others and sacrifice everything for others. And of course, if the only options are that purely monkish life of absolute self-sacrifice and being a Randian egoism, well, Randian egoism starts to sound a lot better, but of course those are not at all the only options. And none of the major options in modern moral philosophy bear any particular resemblance to the straw man. According to utilitarianism, your happiness counts as much as the happiness of anyone else. According to Kantianism, a view that Rand really hated and said was the source of all the altruism and collectivism, where by altruism she means not what everybody else in the world means by altruism, the idea that you should sometimes, in some ways, or to some extent, sacrifice your interests to the interests of others, but the idea that you should have to engage in total self-sacrifice. She described Kantianism as the sort of root of all this in the modern world, but of course, Kant's moral principle, the categorical imperative, states in no uncertain terms that you have moral duties to yourself in exactly the way that you have them to any other people. If you read Kant's groundwork in the metaphysics of morals, one of his 4 examples of an immoral act is failing to develop your talents. His moral principle is that you should always treat humanity, and this is an exact quote, whether your own person or the person of another, as an end in itself and not merely as a means to an end. And even a lot of people like me who aren't pure Kantians thinks there's a tremendously important moral insight in there. Of course, it's wrong to treat other human beings as if they were ATM machines who only existed to serve your own personal flourishing. Of course, it would be wrong to enslave the other person on the island. I believe no less than Ayn Rand did, there's no God and no afterlife, and we only have one life to live. But I draw the opposite conclusion because I also realize that everyone else in the world, all those billions of other human beings, also only have one life to live, and they count just as much as I do. And certainly, just to talk about the social democratic minimum program, if I can help other people flourish to the best of their potential by supporting a system of taxation under which people have to give up some small portion of they have in order to pay for things like universal free higher education or universal health care so everybody else can flourish, there's absolutely no way that you can get from any kind of normal recognizable human value system to the conclusion that that would somehow be morally wrong. And remember, finally, that coercion has nothing to do with it. I know I'm running into the limit. This is the last point. That when you talk about taking away other people's property, well, if their property is meant in a legal sense, what's legally their property, that of course taxation can't be taking away their property because legally it's the property of the IRS. If, on the other hand, it means morally their property they should have, then that reminds us that the issue has absolutely nothing to do with coercion. It's who has a good moral claim to which piece of property. Rand has her theory, let the chips fall where they may at a free market. I find that a very implausible theory, but maybe we'll get a good defense of it as the debate goes on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burgis, for your opening statement. Thank you both for your opening statements. So let me go ahead and just let everybody know. If this is your first time with Modern Day Debates, that we are a neutral platform hosting debates on science, religion, and politics, and we want you to feel welcome no matter what walk of life you're from, no matter if you're an atheist or Christian or theist of any flavor. Second point, if you have a question or a comment for one of tonight's debaters, please fire into the old live chat and be sure to tag me at Modern Day Debates. Super chats go to the top of the list. They will be read first. All we ask is that you please keep it civil and attack the argument, not the person, as insults will not be read. And that goes for the general discourse in the live chat as well. Our invaluable moderators are working tirelessly to elevate the conversation, so please show them and each other and the debaters the respect that they deserve and not hurl insults and attacks at each other. Third, our guests are linked in the description below, whether you're listening on YouTube or via the podcast. So please, if you like what you're hearing, don't be shy. Please click their links and check them out. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Show James that you appreciate the debate, so he can keep giving you guys what you love. Tomorrow night, we have another debate coming. Was the moon landing faked? That's going to be T-Jump versus Alex Stein. I think there's another debate. I don't even have that written down, so I'm not going to mention that. But that is all I have right now. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to the open discussion. We have 60 minutes. Gentlemen, the floor is all yours.
All right.
Guess I can respond to some of that. And all right. So maybe I'll just start by saying that I don't think Rand's view is sociopathic, but if it is, then I think the opposing view is giga sociopathic. So I don't think a whole lot is accomplished by throwing out insults, and I typically try to avoid that thing and just focus on the arguments. So that's what I plan to do here, just focus on the issues. So one issue that Bryn brought up at the beginning was this point that coercion is a red herring, that coercion is a part of every system. So that's not really what's at issue. And I've seen him cite Matt Brunig on this, and I've read some articles where he's made this point many times in many of his videos. And I think there's an element of truth to this. I think it's true that if you have a certain view of morality, morality underlies politics. Politics presupposes a certain view of the good. So we have a view of the good, that's morality. And then how does what's good in the context of human relationships? That's what politics is. So politics is really just an application of ethics. So if you have the wrong ethics, you're going to have the wrong politics. And I think Ben has the wrong ethics, and therefore he has this I think he has the wrong view of coercion. And likewise, he thinks I have the wrong view of ethics, and therefore I have the wrong view of coercion. So I think it would be perhaps fruitful if we now go down to the ethical level and see if we can get at this deeper layer of disagreements in the moral sphere. So from what I understand, having seen some other of your content, you think that I guess you think other people have, do other people have a right to what I produce? Let's say we're on the island, to go back to the island example. Let's say I build something. Does that give me a moral claim to what I've built? Do I have a moral right to that, or does somebody else, assuming there's one other person on the island who has not built what I've built?
It might give you a moral claim. It's not an indefeasible moral claim. It's not absolute. I don't think that, if, for example, somebody's going to die or be maimed in a hurricane, if they can't shelter under it, that your right to the fruits of your labor, which of course workers lose under capitalism. We should also note that overrides someone else's right to shelter. But I should also say, I actually don't think it's true that the difference about how we talk about coercion is a result of difference in deep moral views. I think that it's just true that if you use the word coercion in a non-moral sense, right, not in a normative sense that you're using it to mean bad coercion or unjust coercion, but you're just using it in a morally neutral way to refer to the use of force, to the use of force or threats of force to make somebody do something, like, for example, to exclude them from scarce resources, then it's just trivially true that all claims to property involve threats of coercion. Now, of course, if you want to redefine the word coercion and use it not in the way that it's ordinarily used, which I just gave, but you want to use it in a moralized way, so it only counts as coercion if it's bad or wrong, then sure, our differences in whether this counts as coercion could have to do with the differences in our moral views. But I would just argue that that if that's what it means, saying that what we're arguing about coercion begs the question, because you're just assuming that the right view about what counts as bad or unjust coercion is the one that you're starting with. But of course, the whole thing that we're arguing about is whether particular forms of coercion would be bad or unjust.
Okay, so you've mentioned that there's a neutral sense of coercion, and then there's a moral sense of coercion, according to which it's morally bad. I'm not. I don't typically think of myself as using coercion in a neutral sense, a non-normative sense. Maybe you mean just a descriptive sense.
Yeah,
Um,
I just made a descriptive sense that you're using force or the threat of force to make somebody do something, for example, to exclude them from use of scarce resources. And if you are using it in a normatively loaded sense, if what you mean by coercion is actually bad or unjust coercion, at that point, it's not that we disagree about whether coercion is okay or not. It's that we disagree about whether, for example, redistributing existing property would count as coercion.
okay, so um, maybe it'd be useful to bring in the distinction between initiation of force and or initiated force and retaliatory force, because I'm not sure we would agree that the same things that we would use the same label for the same act. So if I build a shelter on the islands and then someone else arrives on the island and let's say they need that shelter to get out of a hurricane, and I say no, you can't come into this shelter that I built in order to save yourself, would I be initiating force against that person if I
Well,
if I keep them out?
the problem is that there is no normatively neutral way to decide what counts as initiating force, because people who like to talk about initiating force, they don't literally just mean the first person to use violence or threats of violence. That's what it sounds like, but that wouldn't actually capture the distinction that they're going for. So, for example, if I you know, as a cat burglar, right? Stealthily take your TV out of your living room. There's no violence involved. You were asleep or you were on vacation. You know what happened, and you find out, right? And either you personally or I don't know, the police or some private security force use threats of violence to get it back from me, right? That you say that if I don't return it on my own accord, you're going to violently take it from me. Is that initiation of force or not? My understanding is that everybody who talks the way that you're talking, using this sort of phrases like the initiation of force in standard objectivist or libertarian ways, would say, no, 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 you're not initiating force when you do that. But what that really shows is that it's initiation of force is misleading. There's a kind of shell game here because you're saying, you're not really talking about who's the first person to do something violent. You're talking about who's the first person to violate a property right, a moral property right. But then, of course, the whole issue is who has what moral property rights, right? Morally, who should have what piece of property? And your answer to that question is going to be the same as your answer to who's initiating force in a conflict. There's no way that any version of this could do any argumentative work, because you're always already packing in where all the action is, which is that who actually has a moral claim on some piece of property.
Okay, so if the more fundamental issue than what is coercion is what do we have a moral claim to, then let's talk about that, because I
Please.
want to try to
Yeah.
get down to the root of the disagreement. So I asked earlier, if I build something by myself
Mm-hmm.
on the islands, do I have a moral claim to that? And you said something like, well, maybe in a general way I
Yeah, you have
do,
you have a
but there are
claim, but
some.
not an indefeasible claim. There could be
Right.
other
So
things that
maybe
could override it.
okay.
Yeah,
So maybe in an emergency situation,
for
someone
example.
could. Right. Okay. So if it's not in an emergency situation, then I have a moral right to what I produce.
That's an example. I'm sure you can come up with other scenarios under which, even in this sort of island example, I might agree that that there's that you don't have an exclusive right to 100% of what you produce. I would also, by the way, again, I would say, if you really believe in this principle, which I don't, right? That there's a sort of absolute moral entitlement to anything that you produce, which I think has some pretty grim results if taken seriously, right? Because that would mean that people who are incapable of working, due, for example, to severe disabilities, wouldn't have an entitlement to anything. That they would have to just hope that somebody who did have such an entitlement generously felt like sharing with them. But they wouldn't have their own claim on anything. I certainly don't agree with that. I think that, yeah, I think generally speaking, I think the fact that you're the person who produces something, gives you some claim on it. I think that they have all else being equal, that's a pretty good reason to think that you should have it. But I also think that there are other morally important factors in deciding what counts as a just distribution of resources. I think that the point about large scale inequalities that are due to factors completely outside of your control is something that gives us a powerful reason to support or oppose given distributions of resources. I think the very fact, so beloved by objectivists, that we all have a right to pursue our own individual flourishing, our best lives, gives it grounds certain claims about distribution of resources. If you need a certain material base to have even a fighting chance at having a good life, I think that that's something that gives you a moral claim on it. I think that morality is pretty complicated, and you're probably not going to be able to plausibly boil this down to one or two principles and just extrapolate everything from there, unless maybe they're principles like a just social order is the kind that you would endorse from behind Rawls's veil of ignorance, maybe, and that whatever the correct rules are the ones that would be part of that just social order. Something like that might be a plausible sort of general, like extremely general thing that you could try to get everything else from. But unless we're talking about something like that, I think there are multiple values that are important, and I don't think just reducing everything to one, like a labor entitlement principle, is plausible. And by the way, even if I did, I would be very skeptical that capitalism honors that principle, given, of course, that workers under capitalism, generally speaking, have no realistic choice except to contract away, the lion's share of the results of their efforts. And I would question whether that's a truly free choice, but maybe that's a slightly different argument.
Okay. There's a lot there. So, I mean, one thing I'll say is I think everyone flourishes best under the kind of system I advocate. I think there's more opportunity in a capitalist system of the sort I advocate than anywhere else, any other kind of system. I think people who came here in the 19th century, in the so-called Gilded Age, which I think maybe is better called the Progressive Age, because there was so much progress made in that era. They came here for the opportunities to make their lives better. I think capitalism makes opportunity, increases it dramatically over any other system. For people who can't work on their own, I think it's a tiny minority, and I think there would be abundant charity, private charity, people out of benevolence who would be, if they're, so much of their wealth weren't seized by the government. I think many people would offer more to to people who need private charity to survive. But I think that kind of thing is a red herring against capitalism, because it's such a trivial, tiny amount. Especially, in day of the internet, you can just do data entry on a computer. Even if you're disabled, you can earn money somehow. You can support yourself. I think it's easy. I do want to go back to the island
Yeah,
case.
Okay.
Hold on. You spoke for a while,
Okay.
so let me make another point here.
Okay.
If we're back on the islands, you said in general, if someone produces something, they have a moral claim to it. So I wanna see how, if I
Sure.
can, build on this example. Let's say that there's two people on the islands, and one becomes radically more wealthy than the other, like Jeff Bezos
Mm.
level wealth, like um, a million times more wealthy than the other. Maybe because the other is just less talented, less capable. He can support himself. He can live on his own, but he just doesn't have the genius of the other guy. Um, so there's massive wealth inequality. They both produced whatever amount of wealth they had on their own. Now, does each have a moral claim to everything that he produced, or does one have a moral claim to what the other produced? I'll leave it there for now.
Sure. So I think that in the scenario you're describing, no, I don't think that somebody who, in the impossible scenario, right, where you could somehow have Jeff Bezos to an Amazon worker levels of wealth inequality within two people on an island, I would argue you can only have that level of wealth inequality given structural power within a system that people have no realistic choice but to participate in. But given that impossible premise, then I would say no, they don't. Partially because of your description, right? Because you said that this is a result. That level of wealth inequality is a result of talents that one person has that another person doesn't have. Now, to the extent that one person,
So you're, just to be clear, you're saying
I'm about to explain it, right? So they have
he doesn't have the moral claim.
So I don't think that he has a moral claim to all of it. No, and here's why not. Right? That they have. Remember pretty much the first thing I said after the point about coercion in the opening statement was about equality of opportunity. What kind of equality of opportunity we should believe in? The principle of equality of opportunity I endorsed. What J.A. Cohen called socialist equality of opportunity is that inequalities, or at least large-scale inequalities, are, at least as a default, at least all else being equal, we can balance this against other values, but they are unjust if they trace back to things that are outside of your own control. Now, so that grounds a certain amount of labor entitlement, that if it's just, one person chooses to work and the other one doesn't, right? That might give the person who chooses to work, a superior claim, maybe not an absolute claim, but certainly a superior claim on the product of their labor. But even in your scenario, the way that you laid it out, if the difference in talents is due to one person, voluntarily choosing to work on developing their talents, and while the other person doesn't, that wouldn't be as bad. It might be objectionable for other reasons, but not for this reason. But if we're just talking about people who innately have greater talents than others, then no, I don't believe in meritocracy. I think that's a grotesquely undesirable moral ideal. I don't think that the fact that you're born with greater talents, but in itself gives you a moral claim on a greater share of society's resources. And I would also say that the issue about private charity is not just that people have there are people who would become destitute without redistributive programs, although that's certainly true. It's not just that there are people who die without it, although that's certainly true. If man's goal is the survival, I would point out that the advanced social democracies in the world are doing way better in terms of life expectancy than the comparatively more robustly capitalist United States, and where, for example, people die because their medical GoFundMes aren't fully funded. But even if everybody could get some level of sustenance and a long life by living off of private charity, if for example they were unable to work, then I would still say that forcing people to rely on private charity is incredibly degrading, and it makes them unfree, because if you have a positive right to healthcare, for example, just for being a human being, just for being part of a social order, then nobody is in any position to take it away from you on a whim. Whereas if you're dependent on private charity, then definitionally they are able to take it away from you on a whim. And I'd say a society where everybody's trying to craft a more compelling, attention-grabbing sob story on GoFundMe than everybody else is one that's far worse for both freedom and human dignity than one with robustly redistributive universal social programs.
Okay. So there's a lot there. I mean, government can take things away on a whim too. I don't think that's more likely to happen under capitalism.
Nope.
And I think people are going to be more secure, and there's going to be less need of charity. And again, I don't think you can talk about problems today and pin them on capitalism, like medical GoFundMes or whatever. We've had so much government intervention or interference in the healthcare industry and so many other industries. I don't think you can blame something that happens today on capitalism like that. I want to go back to this point about equality of opportunity. I don't think that's a legitimate form of equality to advocate. I believe in equality before the law. So you have the same laws for rich people and for poor people. But equality of opportunity, no, I reject that. So let me give some examples of why. So imagine you're beautiful. You have more opportunities to be a model, to be on TV. Now, is that unfair that some people are more beautiful than others? Should we disfigure the people who are beautiful in order to equalize opportunity of being a model? Take LeBron James. He was, physically gifted. He's a giant man. I mean, most people can't do what he does. Should everyone have the equal opportunity to be an NBA player? The only way you can equalize opportunity is to tear down the people who have more skill or innate talent or innate DNA, whatever it is that they got lucky with. Einstein is a genius. Not everyone's going to have the opportunity to become a genius physicist like he was. Are we going to stifle the mind of Einstein in order not to offend the people who are not as smart? I think equality of opportunity is a terrible thing to aim for. I think everyone should take whatever they are innately given and try to make the most of it and not spend their life whining that someone else has more than they do. I think the whole issue, and this gets to John Rawls, the issue of fairness does not apply when you are talking about metaphysically given facts, like things you were born with and didn't choose. It's not unfair that you weren't born as beautiful as someone else. You might be unlucky, or if you're beautiful, it's not that it was fair that you were beautiful. You just got lucky. Same way, if you're playing a lottery and you don't get the winning ticket, doesn't mean you were treated unfairly. It just means you were unlucky. Now, if you got the winning ticket and then they didn't pay you what you were supposed to get, that would be unfair because there was a choice involved. There was a volitional choice. Someone could choose to make something happen, follow through on the agreement of the lottery, we pay the winner or not. But when something is not open to choice, the issue of fairness or unfairness doesn't even apply. The concept is invalid in that context. So I think that's the basic problem with John Rawls. And that undercuts a lot of his policy prescriptions. And I think I'll just pause there and throw it back to you.
Sure. So on the subject of LeBron James and beautiful people being models and all that, I think there might be some confusion. The claim is not that people shouldn't be allowed to have talents, people shouldn't be allowed to develop talents, that the distribution of talents by nature should be corrected. Nobody has ever said that. I certainly haven't, neither has anybody else in the history of philosophy. What I have said is that the distribution of material resources shouldn't be wildly unequal on the basis of those talents. So, of course, should LeBron James be allowed to play basketball? Of course he should. But I do not think that he therefore has some sort of absolute sacred right to every penny that he earns playing basketball. I think it's fine to tax away all or even most of LeBron James, not all, but to tax away quite a bit or even most of LeBron James's income in order to make everybody else's life better, to provide a fair floor for everybody else to try to flourish in life. And perhaps, a deep difference between us morally is that I just don't think that would be equivalent to breaking LeBron James's, legs so, he can't play basketball better than anybody else, or whatever the other example was, uglifying, supermodels so they won't get more modeling opportunities, a la Kurt Vonnegut's Harrison Bergeron. That, of course, those things would be unjust. People have a right to bodily integrity. That's a tremendously important value that when we're balancing values to decide what the right thing to do is, we have to take that into account. Of course, people have a right to act on and develop their talents. But I don't think that people have a right to every dollar that comes into their bank account from some sort of free market process. And I don't see any reason, I certainly haven't heard any reason why I should believe in such a right. Now, you said fairness doesn't come when things aren't open to choice. I'm a little unclear about what that means. Remember, my claim about choice and fairness is that if the distribution of resources or the distribution of power, etc., is linked to factors that you have no choice in, then that distribution is at least prima facie unjust, right? Perhaps there are other values that that like would once we weigh it against it, if we have to allow that distribution, or the economy will fall apart or something, they might reluctantly say it's acceptable after all. But at least on first blush, the default, right, should be thinking that distribution is unjust. If we can correct that distribution without having to, smash the faces of any supermodels or do anything else that would violate fundamental rights like that, then we should do that. Because, of course, I don't believe, and I haven't heard a good reason to believe, that people have a fundamental right to every dollar that comes their way by the result of some sort of free market process. So, should we tear down anybody to achieve robust equality of opportunity? Well, if tearing them down means redistributing some income that they would otherwise have, then sure, I don't have a problem with that, because I don't believe, to steal a line that's not my own, that we have nerve endings in every dollar in our bank accounts. But if tearing down means like not letting people not letting people be models, or not letting people play basketball, no, I don't advocate that. Nobody advocates it. But I will say, one of the things that oftentimes debates are good for is, at least, even if you can't agree on positions, at least clarifies the differences between positions. And I have to say, as much as I find pure equality before the law a pretty paltry and unappealing sort of limit to the kind of equality that we should believe in, right? There's that wonderful Anatole France quote about the law and its majestic equality, forbidding rich and poor alike from sleeping under bridges and begging in the streets or stealing bread. I don't think that's worth much as ideal of equality. I do find it incredibly refreshing to hear a defender of capitalism say, I don't believe in equality of opportunity. I think that's really useful and clarifying.
All right. Thank you. So I didn't really see a principal difference between being not okay with disfiguring somebody in order to achieve equality of opportunity, but you are okay with seizing someone's property. Some people, depending on your situation in life, you might rather have one than the other, or the other rather than the one. If it's a little scar, if it's a huge scar, maybe I'll take some disfigurement if it's going to save me 50% of my income. So I'm not really seeing a principal difference between the kind of equality you are and are not okay with, equality of opportunity you are and are not okay with. I think when you try to have the kind of equality of opportunity that you talk about, you lose equality before the law. So now not everyone has the same rights to what they've produced. Let's see. I want to go back to the. So you said earlier that even if one guy on the island, when there's two people, one guy earns way more. It doesn't matter if it's 1,000,000 times more, 100 times more, 1,000 times. It's a lot more. But you said in that case, even though both have produced what they have, you don't think either. I guess you don't think one, the guy who has a lot more, has a moral claim to all of his stuff, and I don't recall why that is. Could you address that?
Sure, happily. So to go back to the beginning of those remarks, you said you don't see any principal difference between physical disfigurement and redistribution of resources. I think I gave several times what the principal difference is. You have a right to bodily integrity. That you have that it would be an incredible violation of personal freedom to disfigure somebody's body against their will. The fact that I do not believe that it would be an incredible violation of personal freedom to take away somebody's money. I think that your person is much more integral to who you are and what kinds of rights you can reasonably claim than external property, and certainly than external property in money. That the fact that you might prefer to be disfigured, right? That Jeff Bezos, might prefer to be physically disfigured than to have 2/3 of his income taken away or whatever. Has nothing to do with it, one way or the other. I mean, we both agree that people don't have the right to everything that they prefer. That's a completely different question from what rights people can plausibly assert. What they would prefer to have happen. You have it could be that that you would, if you're a hardcore racist in the South in 1963, it could be that you say I would rather die than see black people given the vote, and maybe you really mean it. But the fact is, you still have a right to life, and you do not have a right to deny black people the vote. So, I mean, your preferences have nothing to do with it. I'm also confused by the claim that equality before the law is lost if you have progressive taxation. In other words, which is, I believe, what I heard, right? If that's not your claim, please correct me. But that if some incomes are taxed at a higher rate than other incomes, that violates equality before the law. I'd certainly say that's not certainly normally how equality before the law is understood. I need to hear a lot more about what the conception of equality before the law is. I think that it's certainly something that I think that that if the kind of equality we care about is just that, like, everybody is subject to the same laws that everybody else is, then progressive income tax certainly fits that standard. If the kind of equality we care about is everybody's interests are taken into account in the same way, in the way that Rawls, for example, cares about, then I think that's consistent with it too. It sounds like that we're talking about some third conception of what equality before the law is that I don't really understand. But on your direct question at the end there, so when we're talking about the two guys on the island, of course, nobody's earning anything on an island. I mean, by definition, you need a more complex society than two people to have like earning, right? That suggests that you have money being distributed, that you have profits or wages, unless the word earning is being used in some eccentric way. But if you just mean that that one person has harvested more coconuts than the other or something like that, then does the one who's harvested far more than the other have a right to keep all of his, and does the one who's harvested far fewer have a right only to his? And what I said is that depends on the reason why one of them has harvested so many more than the other. That the sort of the version of equality of opportunity that I've been arguing for would tell us that if it's a matter of free choice that the one guy has simply chosen to spend more hours a day harvesting coconuts than the other, or something like that, then I think that he would have a much better claim on keeping all of them. Maybe not an absolute claim if the other ones could starve to death or something like that, right? There could be things that would override that, but he'd have a much better claim. Whereas if it has to do with a factor that is outside of your control, then the mere fact that you have more, that you're able to get more, by itself, I would argue, has a lot less moral weight, because we generally think, I think correctly, that that it's unreasonable to have a different distribution of material resources based on things that you can't control. No matter what you do, whether that's being born into a certain caste, or having a certain skin color, or inherited wealth, or even having certain talents that other people don't have. I think in a society where, let's say, the only way to have a good life and have your material needs met was to be good at basketball, then no, I mean, I wouldn't want to disfigure anybody, but I would absolutely not think that that was a just society, because there is an extent to which we can't control how good we are at basketball. There's an extent to which you can practice, but there's a considerable extent to which you can. And to that extent, I think that sort of meritocratic ideal is objectionable for the same reason that racism or caste systems or any of those other systems that assign resources based on factors outside of your control are unjust.
Okay. I'm still not clear on whether you think in the case where both on the islands are producing and they're supporting themselves, that one is just way better. You can get 100 times more. It's not that maybe it is out of their control. Maybe one is just genetically more capable for whatever reason. It makes them more able to survive on the islands. So but I don't think I don't think that makes a difference in terms of the moral claims. Like if one is genetically just endowed such that he can get 100 times more, 1,000 times more than the other, I don't think that means the one who can get less has the moral claim over the more talented guy. So I guess I don't see your reason for disagreeing with that. So you said if depending on the reason for the discrepancy, if it's due to factors out of their control, then you're more inclined to say that the one who is better off just due to luck, he has less of a moral claim than if it was due to something entirely within his control.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see any justification for that.
Okay, I mean, I think I gave it several times, but I'm happy to give it again. I think that I think that it's the exact same reason that we object to any system that systematically disfavors people on the basis of factors outside of their control. I don't see a principal difference between saying that some people should have much worse lives than other people because of their skin color, because of what caste they're born into, or because of whether or not they, what their natural endowments are and some set of talents that happen to be favored by some
Those
system.
people shouldn't be penalized. But that's different than saying they have a moral claim over what others have produced. We shouldn't penalize people because of some factor that is out of their control, like their skin color or their gender. But we're not talking about penalizing the person who produces less. It's not a penalty to not give him something that he hasn't produced. It would be a gift to him. It would be penalty if he took away what he had produced.
But that distinction only makes sense if you're just assuming the thing that hasn't been established, and I haven't heard the slightest reason to believe yet tonight, which is that everybody has a right, an absolute right to everything that they produce. Again, even though that principle is obviously inconsistent with capitalism, I still think it's a bad principle that they have that if because of factors that are totally outside of your control, you are able to produce much less. The idea that you therefore that it's therefore fine if you have a much worse life. I don't see any reason to believe that. I mean, saying that it's a gift if it's a gift to redistribute, and it's
Charity.
a penalty, and it's a penalty to redistribute from. Those are both claims that only make sense given the premise that I just don't see any reason to accept that everybody just has a right to whatever they can get in what you would see as reasonable ground rules, whether we're talking about the island or we're talking about a free market economy. And I think that a lot of the reasons that inequality is unjust are inapplicable to a contrived situation like an island, because a lot of the bad things about inequality, like some people having no realistic choice to go to work for others and have to have to give up so much of their autonomy in that process, like some people having more political influence than others, etc., aren't going to apply at an island. But yeah, I think that if like every coconut on the island was efficiently harvested by one person, so that the other person simply had to beg or do whatever the first person wanted to get the coconuts they needed to survive, then yeah, I would absolutely say that the person who was in that position because of factors outside of his control would have a very good claim to take some of the coconuts. I wouldn't have the slightest problem with that.
If it's an emergency situation where you're going to die if you don't take the other person's coconuts, then it's okay to take the other person's coconuts, even if it involves coercion, because we're talking about an emergency situation. Like you steal a loaf of bread because that's the only way you can live. But we're not talking about an emergency situation. I'm just talking about a situation where someone is vastly better, maybe for reasons outside of his control. He's just genetically endowed. He's vastly better at producing wealth than the other person. So there's a vast amount of wealth inequality. So that's a different situation than an emergency case where you have to do it in order to live. You can support yourself in a very modest, meager way, perhaps, but that's a different scenario. It's not an emergency.
Yeah, I mean, but the emergency thing is an interesting loophole, because I think that loophole might be a lot bigger than you might want to recognize, right? That if somebody, especially given the way that this was set up in the first place, right? So if there are, because I said not that the person was going to die if they didn't steal, but that they would have to beg, or they would have to do whatever it was. They would have to meet whatever conditions the other person imposed to get any of the coconuts that they didn't need, that were going to rot there if they weren't redistributed. And so, if you think that counts as an emergency, right, then I think that's like a loophole you could drive a semi-truck through in terms of your defense of libertarian property rights, because in that same sense, like any working class person, under most circumstances, some people eventually succeed in starting their own businesses, etc. But under most circumstances, most working class people under capitalism would be in that same state of emergency, right? That they're only able to make a living by submitting to the will of an employer.
Easy.
So if the first case is an emergency, then so is the second case, and we're kind of done with capitalism.
No, it's easy as cake to survive under capitalism. There'd be so much opportunity, unbelievable. I mean, just get rid of minimum wage laws for one thing. I mean, think of all the people who
I mean, if you got rid of minimum wage laws, you would immiserate tens of millions of people out of course societies with higher wage floors. Again, you have the higher standard of living. I know that you want to play this game where everything that's bad about American capitalism is because of the uncapitalist parts. It's because of the state intervention. Everything good is because of the capitalist parts. I would suggest that the empirical record shows that societies with stronger unions and much stronger state intervention have vastly more human flourishing. Mm-hmm. But if what you mean by as easy as cake to survive under capitalism is that you can get a job, okay. But in that same sense, it's easy as cake for the person in the situation I described to survive on Coconut Island, because as long as they beg or fulfill whatever conditions are given by the person with all the coconuts, they can survive. So if you think that that stealing is justified in the latter case because it's an emergency, that everyday life for people who aren't in a position to start their own business under capitalism is one great big never-ending emergency.
Let's let Dr. Norton.
The poor people with their iPhones are in such dire emergencies.
Well, I mean, that's a spectacularly silly example.
Dying on the streets.
I love the iPhone.
I love it when socialists paint all
these
the
iPhone
doomsday scenarios.
Because we've constructed a society where it's impossible to get around with a smartphone.
About how it's easy. He was going to say how it was easy. He was going to give us a layout of how it's easy to live under capitalism, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's so many, there's so much demand for people to do labor. There's an infinite amount of work that could be done. And I mean, it's if you can hire people for $10 an hour, hire kids who are just getting started in the workforce, get a little bit of experience, all that is made impossible. And like I said before, during earlier in the debate, you know, you can just get on a computer and do some data entry and support yourself. It's easy as cake. It's easier than it's ever been to survive. So it's just total fantasy, I think, that the picture that socialists portray of how people are going to be dying in the streets under capitalism.
Well, people do die. People do die in the United States in lots of ways that they don't in situations with more robust social democracy. You know, we do have a lower life expectancy than countries that have adopted things like universal health care, or that have made all the inroads into the prerogatives of capital that the Nordic social democracies have. But also, again, I do want to point out the sort of rich absurdity of defenders of capitalism saying that under circumstances where we're making it harder and harder to even function in your day-to-day life without having a smartphone, that having a smartphone is a sign that you can't really have any problems or, you know, complaints about the distribution of resources. But more importantly,
it's not an emergency.
You're trying to have it both ways on the emergency question. Sorry, can I finish? You're trying to have it both ways on the emergency question, because in the Coconut Island case, you're saying that if the only ways to survive are to either steal or to, you know, abase yourself to the person with all the coconuts and fulfill whatever conditions he gives you for getting coconuts, that's an emergency and you could steal. But then you're saying, oh, it's easy as cake to survive under capitalism, when what you mean by easy as cake is it's easy if you're willing to accept a job under whatever conditions the people who have more resources are willing to provide you with that job under, to submit to poverty wages in the minimum wage rule world, et cetera, et cetera. But that's an exact parallel to the Coconut Island case that, if you're willing, I mean, you haven't given me a disanalogy yet, because if in the Coconut Island case, if you're willing to meet whatever conditions the person with all the coconuts gives you for getting some of the coconuts, then it's easy as cake to survive in exactly the same sense. If you're willing to take a job for under whatever circumstances it's offered to you, then it's easy as cake to survive under capitalism. Maybe there's a disanalogy somewhere, but I sure haven't heard it.
I mean, this doesn't know, this coconut apple that we keep referring to is an example that Vosh gave. It's kind of vulgar, so if we haven't given the full details exactly as he gives it. But anyway, I'm talking about Coconut Island. I was talking about someone who is producing stuff. He's built a house. He's built some kind of shelter. We're not just talking about coconuts you picked off the ground. Someone is just vastly superior than the other. That was the example I was giving. But to compare an emergency situation where you don't have enough coconuts to eat or something else to eat, or you're going to die, to working a job in a factory where you have a reliable, you can just waltz in there, easily work your shift, go home, and live on, for however long you want to do that. To call that an emergency is just an invalid comparison.
Well, I mean, it's an emergency in precisely the same sense that if you're willing
you're not going to die the next day.
Well, you're going to die. You're going to die if you don't have a job. What you're saying when you say it's easy.
Sure, but it's easy to get that job.
Sure, and it's easy to fulfill the guy with all the coconuts conditions for getting one of the coconuts, and I have no idea why it's supposed to make a difference whether you're harvesting coconuts or you're producing in some other way. I would also point out that in your factory example. Well, again, but you haven't told me why it's justified. What makes an emergency?
Because it's an emergency.
But what makes one an emergency? That's the point of dispute.
The time span. You're about to die.
So, well, you're only going to die if you don't get one of the coconuts, but it's easy as cake for you to do so if you're willing to meet the guy's conditions, the same way that under capitalism, if you're willing to meet an employer's conditions, then it's easy as cake to survive. I also want to point out that in your factory example, I think it's very revealing to pair that up with what you said earlier about how the closest we've gotten to, quote unquote, real capitalism is the 19th century. Well, let's think about it. It's, you just waltz in and you do your shift and you go home. Well, that shift, right? How long is that shift in the 19th century? I mean, how long is that shift in early capitalism?
How long was it before capitalism when you had to work?
Sure, that's obviously irrelevant. I mean, nobody's defending feudalism. That they have
capitalism has reduced the workday.
Yes.
I do want to try to get you guys to have even amounts of time. So I don't know who's talking more. I just want to try to even it out. I'm sorry. I don't want to take over too much. I just want to even it out a little bit.
Probably Ben, I would estimate, has said more. Not to fault him for that, but yeah, I think capitalism has improved the conditions of working people. I think a lot of times unions are given credit for things that were already happening thanks to the forces of capitalism, free market working themselves out, and then the unions just came along later and have rubber stamped it, and made it law. So yeah, I think things have gotten progressively better over time, in large part thanks to the progress. It's no longer necessary to have children working because we're so productive that people can afford to raise them, give them education instead of working in the fields. So that's part of the progress. That's a testament to the success of capitalism. Now, things get even better than they were in the 19th century. I'm not saying, capitalism is not a static system where it's, stuck the way it was 150 years ago. It's always getting better. So maybe, if we allow capitalism to continue its work, we can, that maybe the average workday will shrink down to 4 hours instead of 8 hours. So I don't think that we can credit capitalism for the increased quality of life that we have, weekends, that sort of thing. It's not due to the alleged benevolence of the government interfering.
Well, I mean, that's just flatly historically wrong. Not only were 8-hour day laws ferociously resisted by the robber barons, so were the 12-hour day laws. When those were first passed, that was tremendously controversial at the time. The claim that what was already existed was just rubber stamped is just as easily checkably historically inaccurate as a claim about this sort of thing can be. And certainly the fact that capitalism is better than feudalism, which it is in lots of ways. Now, not necessarily in terms of actual hours worked per year. I think feudal peasants actually, if you add up all of the saints' days and feast days and all of that stuff, I think the average feudal peasant was actually working fewer hours a year, but overall, sure. I mean, not by that metric, but by many metrics. Is capitalism better than feudalism? Sure. But no socialist has ever denied that. In fact, every socialist who's ever existed has emphasized that fact. Read, the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto. It's all about that fact, that the fact that capitalism is superior to feudalism is completely uncontroversial and undisputed. The dispute is about whether capitalism is as good as we can get, or whether humanity can do better.
Okay. Just want to acknowledge, I don't know exactly what happened with the laws with regard to things like 8-hour workdays or weekends. So maybe the rubber stamp thing, I was speaking loosely there. But I've read, and I also wanted to mention, in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, this is a book by Ayn Rand, it deals with a lot of the myths surrounding the history of capitalism, including things like child labor and unions, the role of women in the Industrial Revolution. So I would recommend that people check that book out if you want to learn about the history of the 19th century. I remember, I don't know if I read it in there or some other source, but the progress that was being made on things like 8-hour workdays or certain wages, like Henry Ford raised I think he doubled maybe the wages of his workers at a certain point. Those kinds of progress were already underway, and later, after they were already underway, it was legislated. I don't know if it was by the NLRB, but anyways, my point was just that the legislation followed what was already happening thanks to the forces of capitalism. Okay, you said some things about capitalism, feudalism, how capitalism was better than feudalism, and no socialists disputed that. I didn't say socialists disputed that. I'm not sure what the point of bringing that up was, but anyways, those are the only notes I had on the last segment, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, the point of bringing it up was that in arguing with the socialist, you made a big point of saying that capitalism, was better than what had existed before, in a way that certainly sounded to me like it suggested that was somehow relevant to the argument that you and I were having. If it wasn't relevant to the argument that you and I were having, I have no idea why it was being brought up. It sounds like, in that case, it was kind of a non sequitur in this context. I think I would not. I think the last place anybody should look for accurate history is the writings of Ayn Rand, one of the most extreme ideologues who's ever lived, and somebody.
This is my economic historian who contributed an essay to her book, who got a PhD at Columbia, I believe. Robert Hesson, I think.
Okay. Well, I would imagine that any economic historian who is contributed to,
of course, in socialists they have their own histories and they're going to do things.
But I think, but I don't think you have to go to history books written by socialists to get obvious facts like there were tremendous
facts.
Yes, obvious facts that are undisputed.
No, they are disputed.
Facts that are not disputed by anybody except the most extreme fringe of right-wing ideologues on planet Earth. Everybody else agrees that, of course, 8-hour day laws, 12-hour day laws, child labor laws, all of these things were things that people died in struggles to achieve. There were things that were bitterly resisted by factory owners in the 19th century. As late as 1914, the Supreme Court was striking down attempts to enact child labor laws. I think that the idea that the forces of capitalism did away with all of these things, as opposed to struggles by working people to both found labor unions and enforce better conditions that way, and also to exert political pressure to have better laws passed. I think that's completely detached from historical reality. I would also point out the continuing irony of saying that anything good that happens under actually existing capitalism, well, that's due to the forces of capitalism. Anytime you point out the horrors of actually existing capitalism, people who die because their medical GoFundMes,
the alleged horrors.
Alleged horrors, sure. Okay,
right.
I guess that's never happened. So if the alleged horrors of capitalism, I guess it's not true. For example, that Sweden has significantly higher life expectancy than the United States. It's not true that infant mortality is higher in the United States than in comparable Anglophone countries that have socialized medicine, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But sure, the alleged horrors of capitalism, no. If any of that stuff is acknowledged to be real, it can't possibly be because of capitalism. It must somehow or another be a result of state intervention. Again, this reminds me of nothing so much as it reminds me of hearing devout Christians saying, yes, all the good things about nature testify to the glory of God, but the bad things, well, those must be a result of, original sin or something.
There's a principle.
God couldn't have done that. Okay, what's the principle?
There's a principle. The idea is that coercion paralyzes and negates the mind. Now, that goes back to the earlier discussion of what is coercion, and we have disagreements with that, and it rests on disagreements about the moral claim issue. But the thing that explains it is that when you use force against people, you're stifling the minds. I gave the example of Galileo having to think in compliance with the church. You're stifling the mind. Antitrust laws, you produce too much, you're penalized for, or you charge too much, you can be penalized for that. You charge less than your competitors, you can be penalized for that. You charge the same as your competitors, you're penalized for that. Collusion. So no matter what you do, there's no way to interpret it. This is one of the examples Ayn Rand gives, is how non-objective antitrust laws are. If you're a businessman, you're just paralyzed. There's nothing you can do legally. So when you use force against people, you paralyze the mind. That impedes and stifles production, and that drives down standard of living, makes everything worse. So there's a mechanism to explain why bad things happen when you introduce coercion into a system, and why good things happen when you free up the system. And I just want to add also on this issue of historical sources. You know, Ben, he's going to claim his facts based on socialist historians and say they're non-controversial. And I'll point you to things I read in Capitalism, The Unknown Ideal. But I say, read both sources. I think it's good to be widely read, read the opposition and make up your own minds. But this is another source that I just wanted to bring to people's attention. There's a reason Ayn Rand titled it Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. Many people don't know about this. The universities are dominated by people with leftist perspectives, and that's all that many people hear.
Yeah, God, I wish that were true. But in any case, I think that there are numerous non-socialist historians who will tell you everything that I just said earlier. I think there are pretty right-wing historians who would acknowledge that there was tremendous opposition to 12-hour day laws, child labor laws, etc. But I would also just say, and I know we're out of time, so I'll just let this be my last point, that I don't think a sort of general, vague ideological story about why state intervention would cause bad results counts as a principled reason to believe that everything bad that happens under capitalism is a result of the respects in which it's not pure capitalism. That really is an empirical issue, and I need a lot better than that to take that seriously.
Okay.
Hello?
Yep.
Ben broke up for a second, but I think.
Oh no! Did you?
I think I got the.
You got the gist. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think the mechanism is legitimate. I think force does negate and paralyze the mind, and I mean, we could go into that more, I'm sure, but we're out of time here. So, it's time for the Q&A, Kaz?
Yes. Are we ready?
Okay.
All right, gentlemen. Thank you guys so much for that spirited discussion. Thank you to everybody in the audience for the questions. We're going to go ahead and get into it. If you guys have any more super chats, they will go to the top of the list. Again, please remember to keep it civil and attack the arguments and not the person. The insults won't be read. The gentlemen's links are in the description below. So if you're listening via the podcast or on YouTube, don't forget to check them out. And don't forget to smash the like button. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to give James some love for giving us this great platform to discuss these ideas. So with that, let's go ahead and get to the super chats. Okay. Extra Juicy. Member for 2 months. How will the government fund policing and military? I think that's for you, Dr. Burgis.
No, that's probably for me.
That's for Dan, because how I think so. So what does Dan think?
Yeah, so it's a common objection. Like, if we have capitalism and there are no taxes, well, how will we get things like the police and the firefighting and roads? I produced a video on my YouTube channel which addresses exactly that question. So I'll refer you to that. But there are various ways of financing the governments. Ayn Rand has an essay called Government Financing in a Free Society, and she mentions various things, some of which have actually been done historically in some places, like lotteries. Of course, there will be donations as well. She also talks about paying money to enforce contracts. That could be a way of raising money. And also, I should mention that it will be much easier to raise money if the government's functions are scaled back to the kinds of things I'm saying, just police, military, and courts. That's so minuscule compared to what we have today that I think it would be easy as cake to fund the government. I've heard some people say that if the government just invested its revenue from voluntary means, donations or lotteries or whatever, it could have enough to survive or to perform all its functions just on the interest that it would get from investing whatever it gets. But also things like roads, those would not be functions of government. Those would be private. I think there would be an incentive So there's a demand for roads, just like there is for games at sports arenas. No one person is going to pay for tickets, pay for a Lakers game, but you have tens of thousands of people who all want this thing, and they'll chip in, they'll pay for their ticket, and collectively they can make something like this happen. And likewise with the roads, it doesn't have to be toll booths. There are other things you can do. Tolls maybe is one way, but you could sell advertising space on billboards. That would be another way to fund roads. You could factor in the cost of roads to the rents that people have to pay, for businesses or homes that are alongside the roads. That's another way you can raise revenue. So there are different free market ways, but also you can check out my video for that.
Interesting. Thank you so much. The next super chat from a long story short for $5 says, Ben, Sweden has more billionaires than the USA per capita. Most of the Scandinavian countries have freer markets than we have here.
Okay. The first claim may be true. The second claim certainly is not, and definitely doesn't follow from the first claim. So I think that if the first claim is true, that's actually great for me because that should just make nonsense of the claim that having this more expansive economic role for the state that you have in the Nordic countries makes it impossible to have thriving economy. But the claim that there's any way in which the Nordics are economically freer, as libertarians understand that, than the United States is just complete. Like there's absolutely no basis to that in reality. I would strongly recommend what Matt Brunig has written about this, the People's Policy Project. In terms of the things that people will bring up are the lack in certain countries of minimum wage laws. What they won't bring up are the fact that you have vastly more favorable labor laws for unions, and you have sectoral bargaining that essentially enforces minimum wages much higher than the American minimum wage, sector by sector of the economy. So you have that, it's not just whatever the market will bear. You have that higher wage floor that way. Other than that, the claim that the Nordic countries, where you have vastly larger public sectors, vastly stronger unions, vastly more expansive social services, things like free college, universal healthcare, etc., oftentimes mostly nationalized healthcare, that those are somehow more free market than the U.S. is largely based, when you actually dig into the facts that people bring up to try to support that, it's largely based on the fact that starting a business in some of these Nordic countries, you have to fill out fewer forms than you do in the U.S. That's most of what people are talking about. The actual number of forms in the U.S. is nothing that would be a meaningful barrier in the first place. But even if it were, that's not because of the sorts of differences that people are arguing about when libertarians and social democrats and socialists argue about whether the Nordics are better. That's just because of America's crazy federalism means that oftentimes you have to to fill out form for the locality, the state, the country, and that places like Sweden have much more centralized systems, which means that you have fewer forms to fill out. But I don't think that's anything that any libertarian or conservative actually advocates, getting rid of America's federalism for the sake of giving people fewer forms.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
Can I add a few thoughts on that?
If you make it short and pithy, but Dr. Burgis will have to have the last word. So go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll just mention that sometimes happiness studies are mentioned in connection with the Nordic countries as evidence that they're better places to live. But Yaron Brook, who was another objectivist who he's actually debated Ben in the past. He's done a show debunking, or at least he takes it to debunk some of these happiness studies. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that for now.
Okay. Well, I find Yaron personally likable, but I'd be very skeptical of any Yaron Brook debunking of that. But also, even if you disregard the happiness studies, I think that factors like life expectancy or just the sort of obvious benefits for human dignity of not having to to rely on generosity of family members or private scholarships to go to college, etc., are still standard of living. I think there are numerous respects in which those countries are better, even disregarding the happiness studies. Although I do think it's awfully significant that countries where it's sunny 2 days a year, and extremely cold, are still ones that wamp us in at least self-reported happiness numbers. That seems pretty telling to me.
Happiness.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Okay, this next super chat is from KWNY Upstate for $5. Robbing someone of their property and giving it to others also robs them of their motivation to work, and yet doesn't impart that motivation on others.
Well, I think it is really interesting to pair that super chat with the last one, because in the last one, we heard that the Nordic countries that have higher tax rates and vastly more extensive social services produce more billionaires. So which is it, right? Does it actually, does having higher tax rates to fund universal social programs that dramatically improve the lives of most people, does that reduce the willingness to work or not? And if it does, how do you explain the fact that there are more billionaires in Sweden?
And I'll just add to that. So again, I'll cite Iran. This is kind of like citing right-wing historians versus leftist or socialist historians. Listen to both sides and see what you think makes most sense. But from what I've heard from my sources, the Nordic countries are actually less regulated than the U.S. is in many respects. And Ben is going to have his own sources, but I say look.
No, it's not about sources. I just explained what that meant.
Yeah, of course, it's not about sources, right?
No, it's not about sources. It's literally about what people mean when they say that. What people mean when they say it's regulated is not that there are fewer labor regulations. It's not there are fewer environmental regulations. What they mean when they say it's less regulated is that there are fewer steps to start a business. And that is because they lack the kind of federalist system that we have in the United States. There's no other sense in which those countries are less regulated overall.
It is interesting, but we should move on. Let's go ahead and see. Caleb Maupin for $20 says, Ayn Rand and fake left are both anti-populist. They view humanity as the mob, threatening the intellectuals like Leo Strauss. We need a government of action to fight for working families.
Well, as usual, Caleb's descriptions of my politics have nothing to do with anything I've ever said or thought. I don't know why he makes stuff up, but he does. And he's I think the most charitable interpretation of him is that he's a severely mentally ill person. I hope he gets the help he needs.
Gotcha. Once again, from KWNY Upstate for $5. How much of Ben Burgis's money and goods does he currently distribute to those in need? ? Please don't say he doesn't actually do what he preaches.
Well, if what I preached were individual charity as a solution to poverty, then there could be an inconsistency there. Of course, I don't preach that. Libertarians and conservatives preach that. So if they don't do that, they're hypocrites. But the accusation of hypocrisy makes absolutely no sense when it's leveled against people who do not, in fact, preach that.
Gotcha.
I don't see what the hypocrisy is on my side.
Well, if your solution to people suffering under capitalism is individual charity, and you're not giving out individual charity, then yeah, that sounds a whole lot more hypocritical than somebody whose solution is systemic and structural, not doing the thing that they don't advocate.
Well, I haven't stated how much, if any, I give to charity, but also the reason some people might not give to charity is because their property is already being seized from them in large amounts by the government, and so they don't want to give any more. I think they would be much more benevolent towards helping out people who truly need it, which again I think is a tiny minority of people who literally can't support themselves. But I think there would be abundant charity for that tiny minority if people weren't being forced to do it already.
Yeah, I mean that's a prediction that's based on nothing. There's absolutely no reason to take that seriously. I understand that it would be convenient for your ideology if that were true, but I would like to see some actual evidence for that before I started to believe it. And even if I did believe it, see earlier in the debate, I think that there are reasons to prefer people being given something as rights of citizenship that cannot be taken away by a whim. You have to change the laws. It's very difficult to change the laws once social entitlements are in place. It's often electoral suicide to oppose them. So it's vastly more difficult to take away universal social programs. Certainly no individual government official could just do it on a whim. than it is take away individual charity. And so I think forcing people to rely on individual charity to meet their needs is incredibly demeaning, and it dramatically disempowers them.
I
Gotcha.
think
Well,
you've got it
Dr.
backwards.
Norton, it was a question for Dr. Burgess, and we do have to move on. So I do want to
Okay.
let him have the last word on this one. Sorry. This next thing is just it is a super, I'm so sorry. A super sticker from Noli D for $2. So thank you so much, Noli D, for that. Thank you so much. The next is from Super K-Pill for $4.99. Dr. Burgess, keep in mind, many people are able to escape their 9-to-5 under capitalism by saving and investing.
Yeah, I mean, some people are, most people aren't. Most small businesses fail very soon after being started. But I also think that if you say that people can escape something, right, then even if that's true, right, and of course it can't be true for everybody. It would be structurally impossible to have a modern, complex economy where everybody was a small business owner. That couldn't work, right? So given that, right, the question is it just to have a social order where most people start out under conditions that it feels appropriate to describe leaving those conditions as escaping them, especially considering that escape would be structurally impossible for everybody at the same time?
Dr. Norton?
I'll just reiterate the general point that I think if you have a free system, a capitalist system, the opportunities that people have over time will get better and better. So as I mentioned earlier, maybe instead of an 8-hour day, it'll eventually be a 4-hour day, because we've made so much progress. There'll be so much technological advance. We'll have machines, robots doing what used to be done by human labor, that work will become less necessary, at least certain kinds of work.
Automation never works that way under capitalism. It never could work that way under capitalism because the incentives don't work out right.
Okay. On?
Well, I don't agree with that. I had a
the point is just that they have that why would you continue to pay people just as much to work 4 hours? Obviously, what would be in your interests would be to either make people part time, or to lay off half the workforce if it or to have people work just as much and produce more. As long as you have that separation between labor and ownership, there's absolutely no reason that automation would ever work that way in the future, just as it hasn't worked that way in the past. You haven't gotten shorter work days, purely as a matter of sort of benevolent decisions, by business owners, that they were voluntarily sacrificing their own products for the sake of their own profits, for the sake of giving the workforce more free time.
I think, I think people would have more opportunities to work less per day if they wanted, thanks to the free market mechanisms. But the point I forgot a second ago that I just came back to me is this point about relative versus absolute poverty. So now today, some poor people are often called poor, have iPhones, they have internet, they have cars, they have TVs. Yeah, I think this is testament to the progress that we've made. People today who are poor are richer than kings were in the feudal era, 500 years ago. And I think we'll just see that maybe poor people in the future will have flying cars. And I think we'll see that. But it's better to have unequal rich people than equal poverty, equally poor.
Well, yeah, I mean, I acknowledged that principle earlier. Obviously, I don't accept that those are the options. I think empirical reality overwhelmingly shows that there aren't the options. That we can have, for example, much stronger labor unions, much more expansive social services, without resulting in the more equal distribution of poverty, but with good standards of living for the majority of the population. I think the history of actually existing social democracy proves that conclusively. I think if you look at worker cooperatives like the Mondragon Federation in Spain, I think you can absolutely have successful, thriving businesses that don't rely on this division of labor and capital in the first place. But yes, if the only options were severe inequality, or everybody being worse off than they would be in a more than even the worst off people in the more unequal system in a more equal alternative, then sure, right? That would be a good, like that. Then I would have to rethink my views. I mean, but of course I don't accept that those are actually the options. I don't think the historical record shows those are the options.
Gotcha. Okay, let's move on, guys. Next question is from Super K Pill for $4.99. Dr. Burgess, low life expectancy is due to obesity epidemic, not the U.S. healthcare system. Americans love to eat.
Yeah, well, it's certainly true that Americans love to eat, but trying to pin the differences in life expectancy, infant mortality, and my favorite, mortality amenable to medicine, which is just stats nerd speak for people who die who would have lived if they'd had medical intervention on time, trying to pin all of these discrepancies between the U.S. and Canada, the U.S. and Britain, the U.S. and Sweden, etc., on obesity alone is just not plausible. If you actually look at the country-by-country breakdown rate, it is true that this is definitely one of the areas where the U.S. is worse. But as anybody who has visited Canada, Canada knows, right? This is a culture that loves its beer and donuts. And the obesity rate is somewhat lower than the United States, not nearly low enough that explains the difference by itself. I would also point out that there are other lifestyle factors like smoking and drinking, in which Great Britain, for example, is much less healthy than the United States, and yet they have the higher life expectancy, lower infant mortality, lower rate of mortality amenable to medicine than the United States has. And you simply cannot explain all of this away just by the single factor of obesity.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. And the next question comes from a long story short for $5. Isn't it ironic that these socialist YouTubers like Vaush never bring on their channel real people who lived in the USSR or Eastern Bloc countries?
Well, I mean, if I have my disagreements with the gentleman who's mentioned, but I've never heard anybody accuse him of being an advocate of the system they had in the USSR. So I think the question, gets down to, the same one, as we were raising earlier about what's quote unquote real capitalism or not, right? I mean, you could insist that anything that was called, socialism, that whatever its flaws were are the same flaws that would be true of anything else, no matter how radically different, that use the same label. Of course, if you're going to say that, then you'd have to say the same thing about capitalism, and all of the flaws of that would be explained by that label. By the fact that it's capitalism. I actually think the difference between what Vaush advocates, which everything I've ever seen, right? What he advocates is a kind of market socialism with universal worker cooperatives. Whenever I've heard him describe what he means by socialism, that's always to describe it. That sounds a lot more different than the USSR than pure capitalism would be from the United States. I think even by the admission of libertarians and objectivists who will say things like, the 19th century United States is about as close as anywhere has got into pure capitalism. Oh, also, Vaush isn't here on my channel. I routinely host all sorts of people who want to debate me. Granted, Vaush does too, but I couldn't speak to whether anybody he's hosted is from those particular countries. But I don't know. I mean, you can watch. You can watch my debate on my channel with Yared Brook, where he goes on and on about his life in socialist kibbutzim in Israel. So I certainly don't see how this particular criticism could be applied to me, and frankly, probably couldn't be applied to Vaush either. Whatever my problems with some of the guy's views, I do not think that he's in the business of he clearly likes doing debates. If you're from one of those countries and you want to argue with him about capitalism, I think that he would, my sense of him is that he would probably take it. Although obviously I can't speak for him.
Gotcha. Dr. Norton, do you want to say anything with that?
I'll just mention that Ayn Rand was she was born in Russia and she lived under the communists when they took over. and she has some first-hand experience with that system. And her first novel, We the Living, is the most autobiographical novel of hers, and you can see some parallels between the Soviet system and then what happens in the novel. So if you want to get her perspective on it, I would recommend take a look at her book, her novel, We the Living.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. All right. Super chat from Spencer Howe for $4.99. I believe this is our last one. Dan, economies only exist because governments allow them to. Who would print the money in your perfect capitalist Randian society?
Okay, so currency, I think it should be private. In a capitalist system, the government should not be able to produce fiat currency as the Fed does and just prints money. I think that causes inflation, and that's terrible for the economy. It's a indirect way of stealing people's wealth to devalue the currency like that. As to historically, I think there's the Canadian and the Scottish banking system, I think, was private. I'm not an economist, but I've heard a little about this from economists. George Selgin is a name I would recommend you check out. And I think he's shown that in the Scottish and or Canadian system, there were basically no runs on the banks, no panics as there were from time to time in the US. And of course, the US had a centralized bank. There was the first bank in the United States, the second bank in the United States, and then there were greenbacks later. So there was intervention with free market banking. There wasn't free banking in the United States for much, if not all of its history. Other countries that did have, or at least had closer to free market banking, like Canada and Scotland, did much better. And I guess banks issued their own currencies. And I would recommend you look into the work of George Selgin for more on how free market banking would work. So in that particular case, I think these other countries, Canada and Scotland, were better than the United States in terms of adhering to free market principles.
Gotcha. So those are the last of our super chats. Let's just try to do these in a rapid fire succession. From Louis I suck at Roman numerals. I'm interested to know where people are getting their morality from. Do you guys have a moral epistemic basis?
Well, in my case, I would say first and foremost, experience. I have my experience of the world, and that informs my beliefs about morality and everything else. I first read Ayn Rand when I was 17, almost 18, many years ago now. And what she said cohered with my own experience. I thought it made a lot of sense. And, I was just blown away by how clarifying it was. She made explicit a lot of things that I think are implicit in my own experiences, but, she's a professional philosopher outside the academic mainstream. But anyways, what she wrote just made a lot of sense to me based on my own experience of the world and my introspecting. So I would say fundamentally I get it from experience, and then she, I think, articulates very well the kind of views that I find compelling.
Yeah, I mean, I touched on this in my opening statement. I think it's absolutely impossible to derive morality from experience of non-moral reality alone. That they have once you know what you count as a good outcome or a bad outcome, or what you count as a rights violation or not a rights violation, that experience can certainly tell you when one or the other of those things have happened. But I think that moral values are not ultimately non-reducible to any sort of non-moral facts. Non-moral facts can tell you how to achieve goals that you care about. They can't tell you which goals to care about in the first place. And this is a logical leap that neither Ayn Rand nor anybody else has been able to perform.
She addresses this issue of David Hume, in her essay, The Objectivist Ethics. So I recommend taking a look at that if you want to see her perspective on this issue of how you derive morality from facts.
Interesting. Thank you guys so much. We do have a new super chat that came in from Chess119 for $2. Dan, without government, who will defend private property rights?
Without government, I guess that means anarchy. So I'm not an anarchist. Part of the capitalist system is having a government. It's just that its role should be much more limited than it is right now. So, but if there weren't a government, I think that would be very bad. I think if you just leave it up to vigilantes, a war of all against all, people enforcing either themselves or they have some gang that fights rival gangs, I think that would be very bad. Ayn Rand has an essay called "The Nature of Government," in which she addresses this issue of what would happen if you didn't have a government, why you need a government for the purposes of objective law. Physical force is something you want to have controlled objectively because it's a destructive force, and you want it to be controlled very precisely. You only want to use it in retaliation. You don't want to initiate force, and you only want to retaliate proportionally to the crime that was done. You don't want to overdo it. So you want to very carefully control laws so it's as peaceful as possible, which means society will be as successful and prosper as much as possible. So yeah, if there weren't a government to enforce laws, I guess private citizens would have to do it, but that's not a good system.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Next question from Brad Becker. Why is Ben focusing on rich people? Capitalism is how poor people become wealthy.
Well, obviously, because I don't accept his premise that that capitalism generally has that effect on poor people. Capitalism is certainly a system under which some poor people can become wealthy. I certainly don't accept that it's a system that has that effect on most poor people. I actually think it's a system that has the opposite effect. It's certainly true that as technology progresses over time, that alone can expand the pot. I don't accept that you need capitalist property relations in order to have that growth over time. I also don't accept that wildly unequal distributions of resources in the present are justified by the promise that the floor will be raised in the future. I think that people who are around right now also count. But I think that capitalism is a system that has the effect of making people much poorer than they would be often under other circumstances. Again, is it better than feudalism? Not a dispute. Is it the best that we can do? That I very much don't accept. I think even the actually existing social democracies, the Nordic countries and elsewhere, prove that there are ways that we could do things other than totally laissez-faire and regulated capitalism that are much better for people at the bottom of the economic ladder. And I think examples of successful cooperatives show us at least a glimmer of possibility of something even better than that.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Next question from Pear D. Bear. Does Ben know what Ayn Rand's definition of capitalism is?
I think we heard it several times in this debate. So unless Dan has dramatically misrepresented it, then yes, I do know.
Can you recite it? I can recite it. I didn't give the literal definition that.
Okay, but you certainly described what you would count as pure capitalism, right? You described a system under which the state only exists for certain extremely minimal libertarian functions, under which there's no redistribution, there's respect for pretty absolute property rights. You listed a long list of the kinds of social interventions that exist under actually existing capitalism that wouldn't exist under capitalism as you and Rand understood it. I mean, I think that you can, whoever you agree with in the debate, I mean, I think that Dan would have had to do, I actually think it's an unfair accusation against Dan that he hasn't at least conveyed what Ayn Rand means when she say capitalism. I mean, I think Dan did better than that.
Okay. Yeah, I don't take it as an accusation, but just for the questioner or for the audience, this is Ayn Rand's exact definition of capitalism. quote, capitalism is a social system based on the recognition of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned, unquote. So she uses the concept of individual rights in that definition, and I was thinking about including that in my opening statements during certain drafts of working it up, but I ultimately decided I wanted to focus it differently. I mean, I conveyed the idea of rights, but since it's come up now, I can just say that her idea of rights is that they can only be infringed by physical force. So if you have a right, the only thing you have a right to is to be free from force. You don't have a right to positive. So what's sometimes called positive rights or positive freedom by people on Ben's side, they'll say you have a right to a job, you have a right to an education, but at whose expense? That's the question Ayn Rand asks in her essay, Man's Rights, also in The Virtue of Selfishness, her book. I recommend checking that out. The kind of so-called positive rights amount to violating genuine rights. She says these are inflated rights. Just as bad money drives out good money when you inflate the currency, well, these printing press rights drive out genuine rights. The only way to have a right to an education or a right to a job or something is to violate someone else's right, genuine right, to not be forced to support that person by paying for his education, paying for his healthcare, paying for his job. So that's a little bit of an involved discussion, which I didn't have time to get into in the opening statement. But the key idea for her on rights is that they can only be violated by physical force. And that means no coercion. Okay, if you coerce someone, you're violating someone's rights. Otherwise, their rights are intact.
Yeah. So of course, it's not controversial that basic rights to things like healthcare, education, etc., are incompatible with absolutist property rights. The disagreement is about which ones are genuine. I think that a right to healthcare, a right to education, etc., these are real rights, and I think that the right to keep every single dollar in your bank account, every single pre-tax dollar in your bank account, is a nonsense pseudo right that I've heard absolutely no reason to take seriously. I would also point out that it's actually not about physical force. That was established earlier in the debate. That again, the threat of physical force is used to enforce any system of distribution of scarce resources. The actual argument is always about which distribution of scarce resources should be enforced by the threat of physical force. And of course, what's really revealing is that, any libertarian, any objectivist, in cases like the television example from earlier, would say, oh no, that doesn't count as initiation of force, because even though there was no actual physical force earlier, there was still an action that violated property rights. So the real action is always going to be on the question of what gives somebody a right to a given piece of property. And that's something that I think libertarians have struggled a lot to say anything plausible about, because you always end up in this bind where if you are you just describing a fantasy scenario whereby things played out exactly that way in some alternate dimension, people would have a right to some piece of property, or do you want to defend actual property rights as they exist in the real world, which very often come after a series of economic transactions, which would be unrecognizable in a world without tons of state interventions of kinds that objectivists and other kinds of libertarians disapprove of.
Gotcha. I think that's a good stopping point there, since Dr. Norton did lead us off. I think we should go ahead and wrap it up there. We are out of time for the Q&A. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been quite a pleasure to host this debate. I want to thank our debaters. You guys are the lifeblood of the show. I want to thank you guys so much for having such a spirited conversation. It has been a pleasure. I also want to thank our moderators in the chat for doing such a great job of keeping the discussion civil. Special shout out to Sideshow Nav and whoever else was helping with editing the question document and helping me to wrangle up all these questions for the Q&A. You guys are the best. I really appreciate your help. I want to thank James and the audience for making modern day debate what it is. And I want to also remind everybody to like, share, and subscribe to the video. We have many more debates coming up. Again, tomorrow night, T-Jump will be debating with Alex Stein on whether or not the moon landing was faked. So you guys do want to check that out. So again, thank everybody for coming out. Have a great night. And remember to keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. You guys all have a great night.
Thanks.
And